Hey guys, this video is going to be my long-awaited guide for getting to Champion Division in Season 10. A lot has changed since the last time I did a video like this, including the point, division, and league systems. The cutoff for Champion Division is now at 6,500 points instead of 300 points like last season, which for a lot of you may sound pretty frightening if you're new to Arena, but it really shouldn't be. Epic essentially made kill points and placement points count for a lot more this season. Each kill used to be 1 point and now it's 20, and a victory Royale used to be worth 10 points including all the other placements, now it's worth 180. What we mainly care about is how the new point system will influence how we play and what the fastest way to gain points is. So do we W key and go for kills, or do we play safe and survive for endgame? Now, you might have noticed the background gameplay isn't actually me. What you'll be watching is a mix of SEN Bugha and Ghost Thwifo, which is the guy that made the Thwifo cone I always mention in my retake videos. The games they're playing in are from the Champion Division Solo Cup on Thursday, where Thwifo came in second.
But Jerian, this isn't Arena.
Well, actually it is. It's essentially arena matches for money, where only Champion League players are allowed to play. That, combined with the fact that these guys are way better than I'll ever be, makes this the perfect gameplay to learn from. Plus, you guys always ask for VOD reviews, and this is basically a more condensed and interesting version of it. We have a lot to cover, so let's start with the only logical place to begin, the early game. If you guys have seen my other videos, you know I always say the early game is the most difficult part of the match for good players, and that's simply because of RNG. There's RNG in chests, floor loot, who lands with you, where zone goes, what loot your opponent gets, and if they decide to push you or not. All of these things can make or break your game right off the start. Our goal is to try to minimize and control RNG as much as possible. For the early game, we're going to study Bugha. Bugha lands at Lucky Landing, and I'm sure most of you know that because there's literally a trophy with his name on it at the center of it. My advice for arena solos is to land at smaller POIs or at unnamed spots where you won't get heavily contested. Please, for the love of God, do not land salty or tilted if you're trying to climb and get points in arena. There's no doubt in my mind that people will W key you right off spawn and you'll have trouble making it out alive with good loot. As you'll start to see later in the video, the best way to get points is to play for placement and for endgame. That means we need to do our best to get good loot, good mats, and simply survive the early game. Jumping off the battle bus, Bugha always aims for the back terrace building because that is what I call the optimal landing spot at Lucky. I talk more about optimal landing spots in my early game arena guide, which you guys should all check out, but essentially every POI has a best landing spot. It usually either has the best loot, the best positioning, or a mix of both. At Lucky, it's where Bugha lands because it's tied for the best loot, and more importantly is that you don't have to worry about getting pushed from the back or from the side. Any other building carries the risk of getting pushed by Bugha, the person who lands at the dumpling building, or anyone who lands at the temple outside of Lucky. After Bugha lands, he follows the same looting path where he goes to the building to the left and then stays on the outskirts of Lucky. For those of you who are landing at uncontested spots, you won't have a problem with the early game. The hard part is when you do get contested, which will happen a lot at most POIs with decent loot. That's kind of the trade-off for a good landing spot. You either get good loot and get contested, or you don't get as good loot, but you don't get contested. Some tips for when you get contested are to try and only fight if you have to, or if you have an advantage over your opponent. If you have the opportunity to third party, or if you have a ton of mats and a good loadout, or you have a great position on your opponent, then yes, you should take the fight. Kill points still matter even though we're going to focus mainly on getting those juicy placement points. You can see Bugha is often the one getting pushed rather than the one starting fights. This is when he'll box up and put his box fighting skills to the test. Bugha knows that not many people in the world can outplay him in a box fight, so anytime he's the one getting pushed and caught off guard, he boxes up and plays to his strengths. Hopefully now, you all can see why I stress the importance of box fighting. The best box fighters are the ones consistently making out of the early game and winning. I know, sitting in a box may seem like the cheap play to make, but it helps negate RNG, which is your biggest enemy in the early game. The last phase in the early game after you fight is finishing looting, choosing your loadout, and getting mats. For arena, you'll want at most 3 weapons and 2 slots for utility. There's basically no mobility in the game anymore, so shockwave grenades are a must if you can find them. A really underrated weapon for arena is the Storm Scout. It's a sniper that tells you where the next zone is, and since we're going for placement points, that's really going to be helpful in the mid game. The early game ends when the first circle closes in. Whatever mobility is near your drop spot, you should be using. Bugha often rotates on hoverboards, or he'll run on foot if zone isn't that far away. Again, your goal for the mid game is to survive and make it to end game. In a perfect world, I'd tell you to go straight to the middle of zone and build a 2-story 1x1. Then just sit in it and wait for endgame. If you play it well, the mid game should be very boring, simply because you're just gonna sit in your 1x1. Taking fights in the mid game is extremely risky, especially if you're not in zone yet. Unlike in the early game, you have no idea how many mats this guy has, what he's looted, or really anything about him. If you want to minimize RNG, you just gotta play it safe and do your best to avoid fights. Do things like rotate into zone late, or stay at the edge of zone if you think someone is gonna push you. The best option is always to rotate early and get to the center of zone, but obviously that won't always be possible. Some tips for fighting in the mid game is to make any fights you take end quickly. Do not just sit on high ground and wait for your opponent to make a move. You will 100% get third partied, and it will be nobody's fault but your own. You either gotta put pressure on your opponent or dip and rotate out. The hardest situations you'll get into are when those absolute psychos push you for no reason. Just like in the early game, your best bet is to box up and use all the tips and tricks I've showed to outbox fight them. If you're in zone, then you're fine just sitting in a box and waiting, but if you're not and zone is across the map, you gotta take the fight. As annoying as it is, you gotta understand that other players are stupid. Even in Champion League matches and pro scrims, people make dumb plays. They will grief you and ruin your game for absolutely no reason. We can sit here all day and talk about what should happen if everyone was good and made the right decision, but that's not the reality of what happens in arena matches and tournaments. If you can get this through your head, I'm telling you, you'll do a lot better. Once you manage to win some fights or avoid fights and base up in zone, make sure you're pressuring people rotating in. If you have a Storm Scout, check it and rotate early to zone. Something Bugha does is he'll base up in zone, then edit down and out of his 1x1 and farm materials to get back to max mats. From there, he'll go back to his 1x1 and just wait it out until the endgame starts after the 4th circle closes in. This is also the time where zones start to move. The reason Thwifo did so well in this tournament was because he popped off in endgame and placed well. How did he do that? Well, the late game boils down to 2 things: rotating and slaying out. Rotating is the more difficult aspect because of how random the zone can be. You want to make sure you're always using the rotation items you have, like shockwaves and launch pads, to make rotating easier. When you rotate on foot, make sure you're tunneling with hard materials like brick and metal, not wood. Wood is very weak and people will be able to spray through it or spray you out without you noticing. Anytime RNG is on your side and zone is close or you end up in zone, also make sure that you're taking shots at people. A mistake I see a ton of players make is they'll rotate to zone and then just sit there, turbo building their walls, just being scared. One seemingly useless kill can replenish your mats, get you more shield, and win you the game. Regarding positioning, high ground is and has always been the best position for late game. You can rain down terror on people without the fear of having people above you or on your level like everyone else does. The 2 easiest ways to get high ground that I saw from Thwifo were to either launch or build on top of height during a zone out in storm. The other way, which is easier and what you'll see in trios a lot, is staying in mid ground for most of the game. Then, during one of the last few circles, shockwave straight up and steal high ground. Lastly, just realize that going for high ground early might not be the best decision depending on how many people are alive and how many mats you have. As long as you play it slow, don't panic, and put all of the zone wars practice you have to good use, you can and will win arena games. So, if this video helped you guys out, be sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and to turn on post notifications. Thank you to everyone using code JERIAN. I'm sorry for delaying the 300k giveaway, but it will be starting sometime next week, and let me tell you, you boys will not be disappointed. Otherwise, that's it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.